delighted to welcome you all here to this virtual talk, the first of this academic year. Before we start, I'd like to pay a particular tribute to Orla and Philippa, Orla Higgins, Philippa Howley, for all their work in organising this. I'm particularly pleased to welcome our speaker. She's somebody who I have been listening to and reading about for some time, and I'm delighted that she can facilitate us this evening. We're hosting this talk, in fact, with our speaker support. Our speaker, as you know, or many of you may know, is a very well-known psychotherapist. She's a parent, she's a best-selling author, and a frequent contributor to radio and newspapers. And indeed, she was on the radio this morning, on News Talk this morning. She hosts also a podcast for parents, and many of you might have come across some of her best-selling and well-selling books, Cotton Wool Kids and Bully-Proof Kids. I was amused to see that her latest book is called Fragile: Why We Are Feeling More Anxious, Stressed and Overwhelmed. And I presumed that it was written in the context of this pandemic, but in fact it was released last year. So we had all those things before we started into COVID at all. In advance of this evening's meeting, a number of parents have told me about their interest in Stella's views. This evening, her particular focus is going to be managing well-being during a crisis. So a heartfelt welcome to you, Stella O'Malley. I know that you are open to people texting you during the talk, and we would really encourage people to participate in this talk by texting Stella through the chat function. So with no further stuff from me, we welcome you, Stella, to talk to us.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? I hope.
Yes, Stella. Yeah.
Good. I'm just going to share my slides so that you're not looking at me the whole time. It's a little bit more interesting. I'm a psychotherapist based in Offaly, from Dublin, and I know Orla Higgins, and that's maybe one of the reasons why you've made contact with me. And I suppose I've written a few books, and it is ironic that I wrote Fragile and I published it last year, all about anxiety, because believe it or not, even last year in 2019, anxiety was the most common mental health issue in Ireland, let alone getting whacked by a global pandemic. So I'm sure our anxiety is completely ratcheted it up. And it's really, really noticeable. I wrote an article, it's in the journal, I think since yesterday, about young people and how they're managing in the crisis, how they've managed with lockdown. And I find among my clients, and there's a few of the books and programs and stuff that I do in front of you there on the screen, but I found that a lot of the teenagers aren't managing very well. A lot of the clients that I'm meeting, they're not really managing well. They're kind of wilting. At the start, it was kind of interesting, and there was a kind of a feeling of novelty about the whole thing. But then as the months have kind of rolled on, a lot of kids are finding it grindingly boring, and they're not as happy as they were. This is a kind of quick thing on parenting that many of you might know, but it's a kind of a nice thing for you to know, especially parents who don't agree on parenting, because generally when you're parenting a teenager, it can be very difficult.
I can't hear you with the television on.
Hang on, I think everybody will have to mute.
I've done that, Stella.
I'm back.
Yeah. You're back, yeah.
And if you have any questions, make sure to just stick it into the chat, and at some stage I'll address it. But yeah, there's 4 different vague types. So there's the permissive, which is the easygoing parent, who kind of in times of crisis lets them do what they want. Very often married to the authoritarian, to the strict parent. And the strict parent often feels very, very happy with themselves up until around about the age of 12, because up until the age of 12, the strict parent has very obedient children. They do what they want, they do what they're told, they get into school on time, they do the homework, and they do everything. Around about the age of 12, the central kind of power is shifted, and suddenly the parents aren't as powerful as they have been in the teenage life. And that's developmentally appropriate, but suddenly the teenager is more influenced by their friends. And it's developmentally appropriate, but it's very, very hard for the strict parent, because they're like, all my power's just gone through my fingers, almost like that. So up until around about the age of 12, maybe 13, maybe 14, you can tell your children what to vote, what you think of the government, what you think of the school, what you think of subjects, what careers they should do. And then there's a certain point, or else they would become clones of you. There's a certain point they kick back and start finding their own opinion about things. And that's why it's very careful that if you're a very strict parent, that you give the child enough space to find themselves, because they will otherwise just follow the strongest personality in the room. And it'll be you until they're about 12, and it'll be other people after that. The permissive, the very easygoing parent, they can often have children who are very highly confident, but they often don't have much staying power. They don't have much ability to be enduring. They tend to go from career to career, from subject to subject. They can't quite study because they're used to basically instant gratification. Their parents are often afraid of their tears, afraid of their distress. And so they're not used to buckling down. So while it can be very pleasant to be easygoing, because you are stopping the tears, you're giving them the chocolate, you're letting them on the screens, in the long term, the child hasn't learned that they have to learn how to deal with tears, how to deal with distress. Distress tolerance, it's a fundamental aspect of happiness, is to be able to handle stress. And if you look up stress tolerance, you'll find some of the children, some of the parents here will say they've no stress tolerance. They've no tolerance for stress, and it kind of gets them nowhere. It's kind of instant gratification, can't handle it. The uninvolved parent, which is the bottom corner there of the screen, that's very much the parent who is often stuck in work, often stuck in their screens, often doesn't have time. And the sad thing is the child of that parent tends to feel number two, tends to feel they don't fare very well, those children, because they often feel that they're not as important as the parents' work. They're not as important. Some parents might be addicts, some parents might be depressed. Very often, it's either work or screens. And they're number two in the parent's life. And they end up with low self-esteem. The best one, so we can all say, oh yeah, I'm over at this one, is the authoritative, which is the top right there, which is having rules, but being a bit flexible about it, which is being responsive, having boundaries, but once in a while letting it go, once in a while having some sort of kind of flexibility, being assertive, not being afraid of tears, not being afraid of your child's distress, and realizing they have to learn how to weather it. And there's been a lot of talk of weathering these summers out and maybe weather the winter out and things like that, but we do have to teach children, we really do have to teach children that it's okay to be unhappy. An awful lot of kids who are coming to me, they're unhappy, and as a result, their brain freezes, because they feel up until puberty, up until adolescence, they think life is just a yellow brick road. It's quite Disney, and then the kind of brick wall of reality hits them, and it can be really quite disorientating for those children. I don't want to give it too text heavy, so I just want to do this quote because I just think it's so powerful. It's Carl Jung, and he says, nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. So if you think to yourself, I wasn't the sports success that I should have been, I wasn't the great career success that I should have been, and by God, my children would be, I would say, slow down there, cowboy, slow down, soldier. And you have to think, is that your life or is that their life? Because too many parents are kind of pressing upon their children the very thing that they didn't get. So if you think you should have been this great sports star, you can push it on your children that they should be this great sports star, and it actually harms them. It harms them in a very big way. And a lot of us have seen it, especially in the sports field. It's a very common scenario that the parent really pushes their unlived life on the children. So if there is something that you're kind of still slightly furious about from childhood, now's the time to be aware of it. Real gift you can give your children is to be honest enough to be looking at the monster under the rug. What is the one thing you don't want said about your parenting? Yeah, if you look at that tonight, just to be generous to your children, if you just take a quick look at that and say, yeah, actually, I'm too competitive, I'm too pressurizing, so whatever it is, it's a gift to your kid, because it's a gift to make you realize that I'm impacting on them. We all are, of course we are. You kind of have to choose your poison as a parent, because we're going to hurt them on some level, because that's parenting, because we're all flawed. And yet make sure that it's not impacting too much. These are the famous stages of psychosocial development. You wouldn't be too interested in them as parents, except I want to point out the adolescence. That's the middle blue one, stage 5, because I want to point out that that is when a child's identity between the ages of in and around 12 and maybe 22, 24, you're finding your identity, you're finding who you are. And up until the around about the age of 12, you're listening to your parents about everything, and they literally flick you off. They turn you off like you're a radio, turn you right down and start listening to everybody else. YouTube, video games, friends, peers, and they're interested in everybody else, and they try on different hats, which is why an awful lot of people might be trying on different gender identities, sexual orientation. An awful lot of that is happening at the moment, and it's natural. It's absolutely natural to be trying different identities between those ages. I would say the most important thing that is the freedom to be fluid at that age, and not to feel that you can be fixed, because many of us will remember when you hit, I would say 25, and they do say the brain isn't formed until you're about 25, and that feels right to me, because I think I was completely nuts until around 25. But I do think you settle in yourself, you kind of find yourself. And Erik Erikson, who wrote this psychosocial, that's well established, about 60 years old, but he wrote some brilliant psycho biographies on people like Gandhi, and some really interesting personalities. And he realized that they take a long time to find their way. It doesn't happen easily, it doesn't happen quickly. And so we need to give our children space to kind of try on different things. It's really hard as a parent, because that might be the child who decides at one stage he's determined he's going to be a lawyer, and he's literally trying on that hat. So in TY, he's all about law and he's going to be a lawyer. And then 6 months later, he's decided he's going to be a pilot. And there's no sense. It's just kind of massive leaps of logic. And what they're doing is trying on their identity. It's perfectly inappropriate that they have to study and kind of direct themselves one direction in college. And it would be much better if it could be a bit more fluid, that they could try different subjects and end up, because many of us know that what we studied between 18 and 22 wasn't necessarily what we ended up doing. And we're all blue in the face trying to tell that to children. They're trying on their identity, and we have to let them have the freedom to do it. I do want to make a little point about the kid who is an introvert, because I feel unlike many children who are extrovert, they're thriving in lots of ways, except for the COVID. The COVID has really impacted the extroverts, because they're not allowed to be with their friends, and they want to be with their friends. Introverts in general, despite the lockdown, aren't coping half as well, because we're living in a very extroverted world. And I find a lot of children who are introverted are really quite, they fall into their screens. They fall into their screens when they feel uneasy. Generally, some age between about 10 and 14, a lot of introverts just find life a little bit too sociable, a little bit too hard, and they end up on their screens. I've got a picture of a few kind of parental controls here, and I am really urging parents who don't have parental controls on the Wi-Fi to get them. Personally, I would recommend Circle, which is the top middle there. You do have to pay for it, but it's worth it. Because for example, with Circle parental control, you can pay for, not just pay, but you can kind of set up a program so that you can shut certain devices down at certain times. You can say, you've got 30 minutes on your iPad, and you've got 40 minutes on your video game, and I'm not giving you any more. And you can set up the times, you can set up the minutes. And so then the kid is just, the teenager is arguing with the system. They're not arguing with you. You're not turning it off. It's already established that you've decided how many minutes you're going to give them on their screens. I kind of think people who don't have parental controls are making a rod for their own back. There's other parental controls. iKids is Irish, and I've heard great things about them. And Our Pact, a lot of people have told me about Our Pact. I've heard good things about, people would argue the pros and cons of different things. My favorite so far is the Circle, whatever it's called, because so many people have told me it's good, and they particularly like the devices and timing the devices. That's the kind of the favorite kind of push on that. I really would urge you, because we all know those boys, they start in and around 10, 11, 12, they get into it. If they have a crisis, if they have any distress, that's when they start getting kind of really upset. And I kind of think that you need to be very aware of what are your boundaries around tech in your house. And if you feel that the horse is bolted and it's too late, I'd say no, it can get a lot worse, because I've seen how bad it can get. No matter how bad it is, I think it can get worse because I've seen it. And so I would say, even though we're in the middle of the lockdown and we've all let the screens, we really did let the screens in, I inclusive, of course I let the screens in. Certainly March, April, May, we were just saying, of course you can have whatever screens you want. All of school is in screens. What can we do about it? Around about the summer, a lot of us got a bit tired of how much screens the children were having. And now many of us are trying to live with COVID and trying to kind of say, okay, we need to actually move this on a little bit. We need to get a little bit better. And jump in if anybody has a question there, because there often is questions.
Yeah, Stella, there's one question there the parents are asking, like, because you're dealing with secondary schools, is 17, 18-year-olds still okay to put these controls on their devices?
I think so. I have parents, and I'm not exaggerating, I had a parent yesterday who the kid was 24 and she was talking about putting in parental controls. And there's a reason, before you all shut me down and say she's mad and I'm going off for my tea. Sit there for a second and I'll tell you. When you have children in college, and there are children in college, and there's 19-year-olds, 21-year-olds living in your house, it never was a problem before because children moved out. And so we didn't see their lives as such, and they could go and do whatever they wanted. And frankly, off the go, they should. An awful lot of children nowadays, they're staying at home, and it's really, really dysfunctional. So they're staying up till 4, 5, 6 in the morning on their screens. They're asleep all day. They're kind of like these owls. It's a really, really kind of stodgy, dysfunctional life. And if your family were eating loads of fast food, this is the analogy I'd make with it. If your family was eating loads of fast food, there would come a point where you say, oh my God, there's just too much fast food in this house. We're going on a diet. The whole family, I'm going to stop eating the fast food. I'm going to stop bringing it in. I'm going to stop bringing in the junk. It's not good for us. We're going to clean this house up around junk food. The same with if there was too much drink, if there was too much alcohol and you're just thinking there's too much drink, the 18-year-old is drinking, the 22-year-old's drinking, we're drinking, we're going to clean it up and we're going to just have it on Fridays and Saturdays nights or something like that. The very same for digital hygiene, that nowadays households, and it's really, often you can see what's happening in America. In America, they're doing it, that we're having kind of digital hygiene in this household. So in this household, house rules, we turn off the Wi-Fi around about 12 at midnight, because that's healthy and because it's the equivalent of not drinking whiskey at 2 in the morning. So it's the very same concept. It's a new concept, but it's really, really relevant. So these 17 or 18-year-olds who are saying, get off my phone, like I'm nearly an adult, I can do what I want. I would say, yeah, house rules really matters. And so therefore I'd say, you don't have to turn it off at 9 in the evening, but I do think you should have a kind of concept that your house has a certain attitude to tech. And it could be very expansive in one way. You could be all about tech in one way, but you could also be aware of the dangers of it. For example, a lot of families say, let's make the kitchen tech free. And so when we brought in the smoking ban, a lot of people stopped smoking because they had to go outside to smoke. The very same as if you make the kitchen tech free so that you're not using your phone in the kitchen, we'll all clean up our manners. We'll all be that little bit more digitally aware. And you all know the person who kind of fingers their phone or holds their phone while they're talking to you, and you feel like there's a third person in the company because they can't really let go of their phone. It would be good if there was a kind of a concept that there's no, and I'd even go further, I'd say there should be no tech in the kitchen or the bedrooms. So the tech is confined to the sitting rooms, let's say, or the dining room or something. Like I say, kind of corralling it and making sure that it's a good presence in your life, rather than it's slipped into a kind of a very inevitable, every time I turn around, I'm on my phone. There's also some people say, only one screen per room. That's quite strict, but I've seen some people say it and saying it works well. So therefore, and I know a lot of couples, by the way, who really like that one, because they're saying, up until then, I was talking to her, we were watching telly and she's on Twitter and it's actually head wrecking. And so it's kind of interesting to see that some people, the screen seems to be going funny there, but some people say, yeah, that works as well. Is that okay? I would be really into digital hygiene in the household. Because of this, the implications on the body, the understimulated tactile, as in you're understimulated with your attachment and you're overstimulated. And you all know that feeling. You've been wired, you've been on the screens too much, and you're very quick to react, very quick to lose your temper, very quick to kind of answer. And that's because it's too much screens. I would say I'm particularly worried of boys between the ages of about 16 and 20, where so many of them, as this boy said, I'm better online, my friends are better online, the sex is better online. A lot of them, they haven't really kissed anybody. They've done very little physical kind of fumblings with anybody. And they've created, they're using porn way too much. They're on video games way too much. And it's their outlet. And they don't have very much. And what happens is they go to college, I would argue, and a lot of them don't have very many social skills. And what do? They find the other gamers and they all stay in their own room. So often I would meet clients and it's like they haven't physically met their mates in months. And you could say, oh yeah, that's the new way of going out and going on. And I'd say, yeah, it's kind of like, you know, to be crass about it, it's like the difference between real sex and virtual sex, or it's like the difference between any experience, Zoom call, having a talk here, and the real physical talk. There is a difference. And if you don't know the difference, you don't know what you're missing out on. And a lot of boys especially don't know what they're missing out on. They think they've got good friendships online. They think they've got sexual relationships online. And I'm like, yeah, you don't know what you're missing. You don't actually know what you're missing. And you don't know you're missing anything. And I would be very wary of those children, because a lot of them have told me I tried to flirt with somebody and it was just also awkward. I just went home, give up. It's too much. So I've just kept any of my friends as platonic friends out and about, and anything sexual I do it online. And I'm like, yeah, you don't know what you're missing. And actually it's very, very dysfunctional. So I do think it's really important. So, Orla, I answered that very kind of extensively. Is there any other questions? I'm not sure, is there?
No, that's perfect. Kind of covers the same thing some people said about, well, children do have all you can eat data. So I suppose it's just about making rules with the children on that line.
Yeah. Oh, I know they have all you can eat data, but what the parental controls would shut the device down. Perfect. Or shut the Wi-Fi down. The parental controls can over that. You know what I mean? So the parental controls are well over that. Now you are paying for it, but I think it's worth paying for it, because you, on one side of you've got a multi-billion industry who's trying to get your kids online all the time. And then you've got parents thinking, I know it's the new way. I know it's the new way they're communicating. And I can see they're enjoying it. And I can see there's great benefits. And educationally, there's fabulous things. And then there's a downside. It's very much like a new kind of type of food has arrived into our world. And loads of us are getting obese and loads of us are really enjoying it. And we have to learn how to navigate it. And I would say shy boys, quiet boys, kids with lack of social skills, they're really falling into those screens at a fierce pace. So I'd be more conscious of them. The kid who's already extroverted, and I'm not kind of saying, because you know there's great things to be introverted, but I find introverts are falling into their screens much deeper and harder, and they're the ones I'm looking out for, because the extroverts already have their social skills, so they don't find it hard, and so they're often okay, not always, but they're often okay. And I'm more worried about the quieter ones, saying make sure that they don't. I remember a child who was a boy, and he was about 17, and he said, you know, I was fine until about 13, and then I just opted out because I didn't want to talk to anybody. I just wanted to get home and play Clash of Clans or whatever it was called. I just wanted to get home. I wasn't even interested in anybody. And then around about 16, it's like he put his head up thinking, what about real life? And he had no... Unmute myself there. So yeah, I want people to be aware of the brain and the emotional brain of the teenager, because it's unformed, and the teenage brain isn't fully formed until you're 25, which really puts exact perspective on Erik Erikson, who was very much into the point, like until they're, you know, in their 20s, they're kind of all over the place, and give them a bit of freedom to be that. But the back of your head is your emotional brain, and the front of your head is your kind of logical, clever brain. So the back of the head, it's full of emotion, it's very powerful, and it's the most overdeveloped part of the teenage brain. Very powerful, very certain, very full of emotion, and is the stupidest part of your brain. Well, this part of your brain, which is the neocortex, it's much slower, much more reflective, contemplative, and it's the cleverest part of your brain. And the teenagers are literally overdeveloped in their that won't be news for you, but they're overdeveloped in their emotional brain. And, you know, there's been an awful lot of science around the brain in the last 20 years. And it's like psychology was rolling on for the last 150 years. And then it came to about the year 2000. And suddenly they kind of did more study on the brain, and they realized, oh, maybe we're doing quite a lot of things wrong, because they realized that we're always setting down neural pathways. And the more we do of something, the easier it is to do. And therefore, people lying on couches talking about their terrible childhood isn't a great pattern to be laying down. Equally, people lying on couches playing video games isn't a great pattern to be laying down. So we're often unaware of what we're doing. The more we smile, the more smiling becomes a habit. The more we worry, the more worrying becomes a habit. It's extraordinary. And Donald Hebb kind of discovered it. Neurons that fire together wire together. The more you do it, the easier it is to do. So therefore, the more you work too much, the easier it is to work too much. The more we feel happy, the easier it is to be happy. The tragedy of that is, if you've had a really, really hard life, you will be more inclined to be worried, more inclined to fights. You know people who are literally in a habit of fighting. You know people who are literally in a habit of complaining. And the tragedy of that is, that's not fair, that the harder you've had of your life, the more used to it that you are of distress. And then the more you habitually find distress, because that's your safe place. So you're never happier but when you're having a fight. And the good news, so that was the tragedy, but the good news is the way to get out of that habit is just literally give yourself a habit, a diet of feeling good. So that might be just watching a comedy every day. That might be, you know, ringing your mates every day, going for a walk. It's pleasant stuff. So your child could have had a hard time in first year, and they could be in this very deep entrenched habit of everybody hates me, and it's third year, and you're thinking, you know what, they didn't like you in first year, a few things happened, but actually it's not true anymore, but you're in this habit of it. You think everybody hates you because that's your neural pathway that got formed, and you haven't kind of got out of it. And so that's our job as parents, to realize, we're kind of like project managers. It's not about micromanaging when they're teenagers. It's about kind of putting in the structures, like the parental control, or like the kind of making sure that they don't give up a sport or something like that. It's you choosing your battles. And for example, they could be in a long and hard habit that is really destructive. A lot of people wonder, how did they drink so much during college? And I'll tell you how you drank so much. You practiced and you got good at it. And is saying your children might be, especially with the lockdown, they could be in a habit of, a lot of us get into a habit of following all these news sites. And I think RTE is in a habit of of counting the distress around COVID, like, you know, and in a way we kind of, you need to watch your mental habits and your children's mental habits, because you could be in an old habit. Richard Davidson says it well. He says, well-being is a skill fundamentally no different than learning to play the cello. If one practices the skills of well-being, one will get better at it. And so his point was, if I gave you all cellos, if I was having cellos delivered to all your doors tonight, and you all practiced it for 15 minutes every day for the next 365 days, and I came back and we met, you would all be significantly better at playing the cello. And the very same is, if you all practiced well-being, feeling good, having a nice time, you know, putting new sheets into bed, having a hot bath, doing whatever it is that makes you feel good, you will all be significantly better at well-being. So it's to do with practicing. When your kid is in a trough, when your kid is in distress, that's where you...
How do I move it?
I don't know. There's also, by the way, there's lines on the screen. I have no idea, this little bit of art, but anyway, presumably somebody's fancy screen. But yeah, where was I going about that? Yeah, you need to practice. So if your child is in a trough, if your child is in the trenches and is in a real dark habit, and you know they are, and you're looking at their distress thinking this is just really hard for them, your job as the project manager is to subtly put in some fun into the day. And I know that's hard, because you might just see the back of their head as they just leave the kitchen, but you try to make things that little bit nicer regularly. Not one big event, wasn't that great, wasn't that great. That doesn't work. It needs to be regularly kind of lightness, regular kind of little things. That's so much more powerful than let's all go to Man United for the soccer. Or I know that's not going to happen in times of COVID, but you know what I mean, like the big event. That doesn't really work. It doesn't work for us, and it doesn't work for teenagers either. It's amazing when you actually look at the brain. I think when people actually go and look up the brain of the teenager, they tend to be much more compassionate towards the teenager because they're like, oh my God, they seriously aren't. They're seriously unformed. So the frontal cortex, do you remember I talked about, that's the red part of the screen there of the brain. That is planning and reasoning. And if you look at that screen, you'll say it's not finished until you're 25, and it's fully developed in adults, and it's immature. It is immature. Their frontal cortex, it is not mature. And that's why they do those crazy, irrational, what were you thinking? They weren't thinking. They were all way back in the reward center, which is on the other side of the screen, see directly opposite the ventral striatum, which is the reward center. They're more excited by reward than consequence. It's literally physically, they're more excited by reward than consequence. They're not even thinking of consequence because it's actually not formed. It's like half a potato. It's not coming out of the ground yet. And that's where they are. And I do think when we realize that and we get it into our heads, it's literally not formed. They're not really up to reasoning, and they're not really in tune with the consequences. I think we lay off them a little bit, because they sound so articulate and they sound so adult. And then we realize, oh my God, they really aren't. And the amygdala, do you see the blue part of that brain? That's the bottom left. The emotional part of the brain, it's more, what's the word? Heightened in teenage years. There's a true story about a guy who was studying psychosis. And he asked his intern, this is actually a true story, it's the beginning of a book, and he asked the intern to look through all these brain images and to put the psychotic brains to one side and the other non-psychotic brains to the left, one to the right, one to the left. And he said, but don't, make sure you know the ages of the brain, because if they're teenagers, you'll think they're all psychotic. And that's an actual fact, that it's literally, it's so developed and so kind of all over the place that if you looked at the brain of them, that's what you would put them in the psychotic. And I have no doubt many of you are thinking, oh, that's what's wrong with them. They're literally unformed. And I do like to emphasize that because it gives us a break on the kids, and this is the synopsis: low judgment, very immature planning, their analytical brain is underdeveloped, high emotionality. Emotional brain is literally more powerful at that point. It will calm down around about 25 or so. For some a bit younger. Excitable reward system. They're more excited by reward than consequence. Low impulse control. And they're sensitive to social judgment in a way that they'll never be more again. In and around those ages, 12 to 20, early 20s, they're most influenced by their peers. Because if they were massively influenced by you, they'd become clones of you. So instead, they're taking in all the other influences, trying on loads of different things, and then they become themselves in and around their 20s. And, like these days, there's an extraordinary amount, the way I was talking about screens, it's quite noticeable that quite a lot of children are, they're getting very into kind of a combative life online, where they're shouting people down, and it's becoming we're becoming afraid to say our piece. And I know I'm considered controversial in some circles because I try to always be honest and authentic. And it's quite important that parents don't allow children, because we glory in childhood these days and we kind of treat the kiddie king in the nursery, we give them an awful lot of power. I think we need to be very careful that we hold our own, that they aren't fully grown. And just because they might be very impressive online and they might be very articulate, they're not fully formed, and they're very quick to judge. And they're very quick to tell you, that you're, cis het normative, you know, and you're Trumpian and you're this and you're that. And they have all these words and they're looking for identities. It's developmentally natural for them to be looking for identities, but a lot of them are jumping. You know, and I know, anybody who's my age, you will have seen the cure heads, you will have seen the kind of the goths, the emos. Before that, there was punks. There's been identities all along for children, really, since the teenagers have been given any sort of freedom. Nowadays, a lot of the identity is around politics, and it's around quite a kind of, I would argue, quite a combative life, and very, very involved with the online world. And I think a lot of parents are quite impressed and intimidated by their children. They're saying words and jargon that the parents don't know. And so the parents are often kind of silenced by this, thinking, I don't even know these words. Like, what are they? What is he talking about? And so then they silence themselves. And it would be better if you could keep on talking about, you know, the only way to have a civil society is to be able to discuss our issues. And no platforming and silencing people really kind of leads us to Israel and Palestine. It doesn't really lead us to anywhere civil. I'm not sure, is there any more questions? I'm not sure if there is.
There was just one about, it's going back to introverts versus extroverts, not versus, sorry, it's just, can you profile characteristics of both introverts and extroverts?
Oh, yeah.
And can an introvert pretend to be an extrovert to be popular? So come out of their comfort zone to...
It's just say that last one, can an introvert become an extrovert? Is it?
No, can an introvert pretend to be extrovert, to be popular?
Oh my God, yes. Definitely introverts pretend to be extroverts, and it comes across a little bit all over the place and most people see it, but the rule of thumb, it's very, very easy rule of thumb to figure it out, is if you get your energy from being alone, you're an introvert. You get your energy from being with people, you're an extrovert. And some people just literally, my daughter would be an obvious extrovert. She just comes alive when there's people. And during the lockdown, she literally wilted like a plant that didn't have enough water. There wasn't enough people. That was it. There was nothing more. She just needed other people. While introverts, actually, a lot of them were fine during the lockdown. It wasn't that much of a stress for the introverts because they're happy. They get their energy from being alone. Now, there's about 40% and 40%. And in the middle is people like me. I like being alone. I get my energy from being alone. Nobody would call me an introvert. Look at me sitting here, standing here, talking. So I certainly don't have the normal. It's the middle where you can swing kind of both ways, because I'm certainly extroverted when I'm out, but I need an awful lot of time on my own. Now, when you talk about that, the kids who try to be extroverted, in a way, there's a great book. Anybody who has an introverted kid and they're worried about them, I really recommend reading the book Quiet by Susan Cain. It's really good, and it's a really good reflective book of up until around the 1990s, for centuries, introverts were absolutely celebrated as the deep thinkers, the Abraham Lincolns, the serious academics, the serious people who could contribute to the world. And extroverted were considered a bit flaky and a little bit, butterflyish. Then in and around the 1990s, 2000s, they started glorying in the charismatic leader. And there was a lot of bankers, I'm sure a few of you can think of them in Ireland, very charismatic. And these charismatic bankers, they're all about gut feeling. They weren't interested in the accountants in the back of the room who were saying, I'm not sure we should do this. I'm not sure this is good. They were like, yeah, you're just being a chicken. I'm charismatic. I'm going by my energy. I don't need this. Classic extrovert, all full of their kind of energy. And it didn't end well. 2008 happened, and the glorying in the extrovert kind of, bit us. It bit us badly. So while I think extroverts have a huge amount to offer, it's like we've fallen into the cult of the extrovert in the last 20 or 30 years. And I think introverts feel wrong in a way that they never felt before. They used to be considered very intelligent, quiet, deep thinkers. So I do recommend, if anybody has an introvert, read the book Quiet and relay the stories to your child. You know what I mean? Sometimes you might be mad for a child to watch a film, to read a certain book. Sometimes you should read it and tell them the little clips that will get their interest, to remind them, actually, there's so much merit. This is a new thing to be all about the extroverts, and there's so much merit in being an introvert. But the kid who tries to be I think there's a real gift a parent can do is when they kind of introduce the child to themselves, as in say, you know, I know what you're like, you know, you're quiet and you're a deep thinker and you're probably going to end up with a small group of really good friends. You're probably not going to be a social butterfly who goes from one party to another. And I don't think you'd be very happy. So the more that you can kind of feed back in a gentle way, because you mightn't have it exactly right, but in a gentle way, your vibe about where your kid is at, the more they can accept, oh, that's who I am. You know what I mean? That's who I am, as opposed to I'm just this kind of weirdo who nobody likes. The more they realize, no, you have your place in the world, and there's plenty of them out there. It can be very hard, I think, these days. Like I say, I think they fall into their screens a lot. But if your child does have distress, I love that quote. Anybody who knows me will know I'm a bit mad about Carl Jung, the psychologist, but he says this lovely quote: the right way to wholeness is made up of fateful detours and wrong turnings. And you could say in a lot of levels, a lot of our lives between the ages of about 10 and 25 are fateful detours and wrong turnings. We go wrong a lot of the time in those years. We make friends with people who you'd really look back and think, who were they? You have partners that are pretty dodgy. And then we kind of settle, hopefully, and find our place. So those fateful detours and wrong turnings, we have to watch our children go through them. And it's very, very awful. It's awful to watch them go through it. And yet it's important. So when something awful happens, it might be happening right now. Your child might be just literally not coping with the lockdown, not coping with the lack of sports, not coping with whatever it is that they really need. This is when you need to read up about post-traumatic growth. If somebody's coming to me and they're knocking along, well-being is fine, and then a negative event happens, they can either come out on the kind of, come out of the experience weaker, they can come out of the experience the same, or they can come out of the experience stronger. And what I'd like parents to think about is, you've been all through, I presume, bad times in your life. You might have got demoted, you might have got fired, you might have not got the qualifications that you needed, you might have got dumped. A lot of us have been through hurt. And what really mattered, I would argue, and a lot of people would agree, when you've been through the hurt is how it was managed. So if you can at all help your child to manage their distress, and then they could come out stronger. And that's really, really hard to do. It's the job of every therapist. It's kind of the most important kind of part of every therapist. I'm coming up to the end, so I might just give you this kind of process, and then if you have any questions, I'll see if you have them. But I'm going to give you this process of how you might connect with your child who's had a lot of distress. So there's something happened, something's kicked off, and they're not in good form. Step one, and it's a really important step. And so if somebody lands into my office and they are really distressed, my first job and your first job as parent is to clarify, because we tend to presume. So they might come in saying, nobody likes me, everybody hates me in school, I can't do the work, I hate it, the lockdown is just killing me off, and I just hate everything. And so my job as a therapist is to clarify what is exactly wrong. And that takes questions and gentle questions. And a lot of me saying, I might be wrong, but is it the fact that everybody hates you is really bothering you, or is it the work? So you're trying to clarify, because they're just spilling out. They don't even know what's the really thing. If they can have a gentle conversation, if you can kind of ask, if you can be really have your wits about you and ask the right questions, on some level, you should be able to pinpoint what's really drilling my mind is the work. I'm not coping with it. And I don't like that they don't like me, but actually it's the work. Imagine for this kid. It could be anything. It doesn't matter, but your job is not to jump with it. And so many of us, myself included, especially when I'm not wearing my therapist hat, it's easy to jump with the thing that would most bother me. So I'd be most bothered about not being liked by people. And so I'd kind of, oh, it must be awful. They don't like you. Why don't they like you? And off you've gone down the train of not being liked. And you've missed. They said a few things and you didn't clarify what is the most. If at all, you could say, what's the worst? Or you could say, if you were to kind of grade them 1, 2, 3, and they said they're all awful. Okay. And is it, and literally ask the questions, is it the same? Do you know what I mean? And push it a little bit. So that's the first step in the process, is where you're clarifying. The second step is you're communicating back. You're saying, okay, so if I'm right, you're communicating back what the client or the child has told you, which is, okay, so if I'm right, what's really upsetting you is you can't keep up with the work. You think you're not able for it, and you think lots of people don't like you. And the combination of that is just making you just absolutely, your brain is fried. And now everything is wrong. You've just blackwashed everything as a result. And you will generally, if you communicate it properly, and this is a key point, if you do properly, if you have on some level say, if I'm right, and you ask lots of questions at this point, you'll say, if I'm right, is that it? And they'll generally, you'll see some sort of physical reaction, some sort of kind of, yeah. And you'll see their shoulders, or they'll sigh, or they're kind of, there's some sort of physical reaction of, yes, that's what it is. And you'll know you've got it right, that they've kind of communicated some sort of physical, yeah, that's it. And it might even be just, they might even just look up at you, but it'll be some sort of physicality around it. And the third step of that, so it's clarifying it, then it's communicating it back, and then you're connecting with them. And that's where you bring your real true self. So many of us as parents were a little bit fake with our children. So they tell us this awful situation where they can't keep up with the work. Imagine, nobody likes you, horrible. And we say, you put your head up straight and you smile at everybody and you'll be fine. They just think, oh, good luck, goodbye, I'm out of here. Because it's really undermining, and it's really depressing when somebody kind of minimizes your deep distress. So that's where you have to, before you do your inspirational, and I really mean this, before you do your inspirational talk, if you have to do it, first of all, take a moment to connect and just go, oh my God, I get you. Actually, that's really hard. And you have to slow right down and go into their space for that. And that is real, authentic you. And a lot of parents are afraid of their child's distress, so we minimize it and we pretend it's not there. And we'd rather pretend that they're only little kids problems. And so we minimize the distress, and so we don't really give them the authentic. That's really hard. And I know, if you're talking to your friend and she told you all those things that were happening in work and nobody liked it and she couldn't keep up with the work, if you told her you'd be fine, you go up there with your head held straight, you just roll your eyes away, yeah, whatever, yeah. And what you really need to do is go, oh my God, that's really hard. And the fourth thing, the final thing, so after first of all, you've clarified, then you've communicated, then you've connected at a real level. That's where the real gold is happening. The fourth thing is a bit of solidarity. And it doesn't mean an inspirational speech, which they're all frankly rolling their eyes at. They've had too many memes, too many GIFs, too many kind of inspirational kind of posters. This is where it's solidarity, where you're literally thinking, what will we do? And if your friend told you about this and her work, and if you said, well, what can we do to make it better? You would feel better. You would immediately feel better for the feeling of shoulder to shoulder. What can we do? What can me and you work together? So it's a kind of feeling of, I'm with you. I'm not taking over. I'm shoulder to shoulder with you. And that's enough. Brene Brown has a lovely quote, and I'll finish with this and see if there's any questions, but she's a lovely quote, which says, the most important thing that you can do, the most important response you can make to somebody is to connect. If you can just connect, that this is hard, I get it, I'm with you. That's more powerful than anything else. I remember my husband was very, very sick once, and all my friends would turn into hospital consultants telling me what should happen, and he was fine in the end. But I remember one friend shone out, and she was the friend who was on the phone, and she just literally went, oh, Stella. And I says, yeah, this is really hard. Don't be giving me all this. That's what you need to be doing. Turn up in real life for your kids, and then they'll come out stronger because they'll know there was somebody with me. I was okay. So is there any questions? I hope you enjoyed the talk. I hope you found it beneficial. I don't know, is there any questions there?
No, Stan, getting great feedback here, Stella. Thank you.
Oh, good.
One or two people, a few people actually, more than that, have come back to me. I think you may have addressed it in what you're saying, but they're saying, while you have covered it, like there are many teens, specifically 16, 17-year-olds, sorry, I'm just trying to find some of them here, that
I've seen it.
No matter how hard they try, they're just not been able to break them down. Any advice?
Oh, sorry, what do you mean break them down?
Like to actually get them to talk. So I know you have covered it by saying go into your clarification, communication.
Yeah, that's very hard when you just see the back of their head.
Yeah.
In a certain way, there's certain kids I do think that we really need to emphasize. Some people aren't, especially 16, 17-year-old boys, they mightn't be the most verbal communicators in the world. And sometimes actually the physicality of communicating matters more. And that would be, lighten the fire, making their favorite dinner, you know, giving them their comfy jumper. It's kind of the subtlety of making life physically nicer for them in a kind of a warm way, because they're not able to verbally, and because we can be, especially women, but women can be so verbal, we're like, oh, they have to talk about their feelings, they have to talk about them. And I'm like, yeah, some of them really don't and can't. And sometimes a kid would come to me and they'd be just, you know, and so we'd have to be quite slow and talking. You'd have to really slow it down and be more about the physical kind of comforts and the gentle kind of pleasant way of living, making the kind of house less tense, making the atmosphere more gentler. They will kind of unfold better rather than asking them always to produce words. You're not communicating with words, you're choosing to go in on their communication, which is making their life easier in a physical kind of gentle, tender way, rather than actually giving them words. I remember I was a fairly nuts teenager, and you know, I was in my room and it was like the lion's den. Nobody came into the room. And my mom once came in and she opened the bedroom door like you were throwing meat to a lion, and she threw in a Snickers bar onto the bed and walked away. And you know, I was actually really, really lovely. I still remember it. It was just such a nice gesture of, I could see you're all over the place and here you go. And that's what I mean, that if you can in some way communicate some sort of gentle solidarity of, you're having a bad time, I'm not going to press you to talk because it just makes you stressed. I'm going to make life gentler, easier, more tender, nicer for you. You're communicating in a different way, but it's just as important. Any other questions?
Just wondering, how do you figure out if a child is introvert or isn't socializing because of low self-esteem?
Yeah, a lot of people who are introverted are presumed to have low self-esteem, and a lot of them don't. So, you know, I think we tend to put that badge on them. And I suppose it's the big question is, what's their self-talk like? How do they talk about themselves? And if they do talk about themselves in a dark and harsh way, that's where I'd be really kind of kicking in on that and say, nah, it's not on. You have to be gentle with yourself. You have to talk to yourself in a nice way. Don't talk about my son like that. And that might be your son in front of you. As in, no, we're not doing harsh talk. You're having a hard time. We need to be nice to you. We need to watch our self-talk. But that's the way, the giveaway with self-esteem is your self-talk. What is their self-talk like? Will I leave it at that? Because I'm aware that people didn't want to overrun it. I'm sure you've more to be doing than looking at Zoom all night. I have another hour of presentation.
We could listen to you all night, Stella.
Yeah.
Just, Stella, everything else that's coming in is just saying super talk, super inspirational, and thank you so much.
Great.
From everybody.
And they've recorded it so people can get the slides and stuff.
Yeah, thank you.
Could I just
I'll hand it over to Breda there now as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Orla, for facilitating it too. Stella, I just like to say that I'm really profoundly grateful to you for being so honest and substantial and sincere. And I think that it's great credit due to your mother and to your parents for allowing you to become the person that you've become in that kind of confidence to really communicate the reality and the subtlety and the challenges of good parenting. And I think that very many of us will have taken a lot. You covered so many issues that, in fact, I'd quite like it to go on longer, or to have you speak again, because you touched on so many topics. I love the what you said about watching your mental habits, and I think it's a really practical thing to say to our boys and to say to ourselves and to say to our friends. The idea that you will become what you practice is a very strong, positive message. The image that you draw of that it's not a good idea to be lying back on the sofa complaining about the disadvantages your parents inflicted on you, but instead to be, becoming what you want to become, and us as parents in having the patience and the whatever it is, it's more than patience. It's something deep that will allow our sons and our children generally to become themselves.
Yeah.
It really was a very, very impressive presentation, and on behalf of the Parents Association and on behalf of the parents who listen tonight, I'm very, very grateful. We're all very grateful to you. I know, Orla, that you plan to put the slides on the website, and I think I've seen the scripts coming in, that there's a real hunger for those. I don't know what it was like for you parents listening to this tonight. It was our first virtual talk. I hope it was satisfactory. Our speaker certainly can't be blamed for any unsatisfactory nature of it. It was very, very positive. And I think our time is up from our point of view, but we